Sometimes we run to the mountains to escape our pain, only to find that our deepest fears have been waiting for us all along. June Whitmore learned this truth at 57. After 20 years of thinking, she had finally found peace in the Blue Ridge wilderness. She lived alone in a small cabin, far from the world that had broken her heart and stolen her trust. Her days were simple. She chopped wood, tended her garden, and walked the forest trails that had become her only companions. The mountains had given her what she needed most: silence and solitude. But that morning, while following deer tracks near an old ridge, June found something that didn't belong. A wooden coffin, half buried in the mossy earth. No grave marker, no explanation. Just an old box that seemed to be waiting for her. What could be inside that would make a strong mountain woman scream for help? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the Blue Ridge peaks like memories that refused to fade, and June Whitmore understood that feeling better than most. She stood on her cabin's weathered porch, watching the sun paint the valley in shades of gold and amber, her hand resting on the oak walking stick she'd carved her first winter here. 20 years had passed since she'd fled to these mountains, with nothing but a broken heart and a fierce determination to disappear. Yet some mornings still felt like that first frightening day when she'd stepped off the Greyhound bus in the nearest town and started walking toward what she hoped would be her salvation. The cabin had been a ruin, then 4 walls and a questionable roof that belonged to no one and everyone, depending on who you asked. June had made it hers through sweat, stubbornness, and the kind of desperate energy that comes from having nowhere else to go. She'd patched the roof with salvaged metal and determination, chinked the gaps between logs with mud and moss, and slowly transformed the abandoned structure into something that felt like home. More than a home. Really, it had become her fortress against a world that had taken everything she'd once believed about trust, loyalty, and the basic goodness of people. Her daily routine had evolved over the years into a rhythm as predictable as the seasons. She rose with the sun, not from any particular virtue, but because her body had adapted to the mountain's schedule. Coffee first, real coffee, the one luxury she allowed herself, ordered twice a year from a catalogue and picked up during her rare trips to town. She'd sit on the porch with her chipped ceramic mug, listening to the forest wake up around her. The sounds had become as familiar as her own heartbeat: the distant call of a hawk, the rustle of squirrels in the oak trees, the soft whisper of wind through pine needles. After coffee came the morning inspection, a walk around her small homestead to check for problems that needed attention. The garden in summer, where she grew enough vegetables to last through winter if she was careful. The woodshed, always in need of restocking. The small solar panel she'd installed 5 years ago, her one concession to modern convenience, which powered a radio and a few LED lights. The hand pump that brought water up from the well she'd dug herself. Learning through trial and error and more. Then a few colourful words that would have surprised the people who'd once known her in her previous life. That previous life felt like a story. Someone had told her about another person. June Whitmore, Senior Vice President of Marketing at a Fortune 500 company. June Whitmore, who'd worn tailored suits and given presentations to boardrooms full of men who pretended to listen while they decided her fate behind closed doors. June Whitmore, who'd believed that competence and dedication were enough, who'd trusted her mentor when he'd promised her the promotion she'd earned, who'd been naive enough to think that loyalty worked both ways. The betrayal hadn't been sudden. That might have been easier to bear. Instead, it had been a slow erosion of everything she'd built over 15 years of 60-hour weeks and sacrificed weekends. Projects reassigned without explanation, meetings held without her knowledge. Credit for her ideas given to younger colleagues, who smiled sympathetically while they stepped on her back to reach the next rung of the corporate ladder. When the layoffs came, she'd been in the first wave. Her years of service and stellar performance reviews, meaning nothing against the spreadsheet, that reduced her to a line item easily deleted, but the professional betrayal had been nothing compared to the personal one. David, her partner of 8 years, had been understanding and supportive right up until the severance pay ran out. Then the understanding became impatience, the support became subtle criticism, and finally the truth came out. He'd been seeing someone else for months, someone younger, more successful, more suitable for the life he wanted to build. The apartment they'd shared, the friends they'd cultivated, the future they'd planned. All of it had been built on foundations that crumbled the moment her career did. June had learned the hard way that in her previous world, you were only as valuable as your last quarterly report. When the numbers stopped adding up in her favor, she discovered how quickly love could turn to disappointment, how fast friends could become strangers who were suddenly too busy to return phone calls. She'd spent 6 months after the layoffs trying to rebuild, sending out resumes and going to interviews where younger, hungrier candidates were always just a little more appealing to. Employers looking toward the future, rather than honoring the past. The breaking point had come on a particularly grey February morning when she'd been waiting for a bus after another unsuccessful interview. She'd been standing there in her best suit, holding a portfolio full of achievements that no one seemed to care about anymore, when she'd realized she had nowhere to go. Not just that day, but in life. The apartment was David's now. The job search felt increasingly futile. The friends had all chosen sides, and she'd lost. She'd stood there in the slush and bitter wind, watching her breath cloud in the cold air, and made a decision that had surprised even her. She'd walked to the Greyhound station and bought a ticket on the next bus, heading toward the mountains. The first few years in the Blue Ridge had been harder than she'd imagined possible. City skills didn't translate well to mountain living, and she'd made every mistake a greenhorn could make. She'd chosen the wrong spot for her garden and watched her first crop fail. She'd underestimated how much firewood she'd need and spent a miserable January rationing heat. She'd gotten lost on trails she thought she knew and spent terrifying nights in the woods before finding her way home. Each failure had been a lesson, and each lesson had made her stronger, more self-reliant, more confident in her ability to survive on her own terms. The walking stick in her hand had been one of her first successful projects, carved during those early days when she'd had more time than skill. She'd found the oak branch after a storm, straight and strong, and exactly the right height for her frame. Working on it had been meditative, a way to keep her hands busy while her mind processed everything she'd left behind. She'd sanded it smooth and carved simple patterns along its length, not decorative flourishes, but practical grips that made it easier to hold. Over the years, it had become more than just a tool for navigating rough terrain. It was a symbol of her transformation, proof that she could create something useful and beautiful with her own hands. The mountains had taught her things her corporate training never covered: how to read the sky for weather signs, how to preserve food without refrigeration, how to find medicinal plants when the nearest pharmacy was 40 miles away. She'd learned to track animals not for hunting. She'd never developed a taste for that, but to understand the rhythms of the forest around her. Deer paths led to water sources. Bird behavior warned of approaching storms. The changing calls of insects marked the progression of seasons more accurately than any calendar. Most importantly, the mountains had taught her the value of silence, not just the absence of noise, but the presence of peace. In her previous life, silence had been uncomfortable, a void that needed to be filled with conversation or music, or the constant buzz of electronic devices. Here, silence was a companion. It allowed her to hear things she'd never noticed before, the subtle differences in bird songs that indicated territory disputes, the whisper of wind that warned of changing weather, the quiet sounds of her own thoughts, finally settling into something resembling wisdom. She'd made a few friends over the years. Though friendship in the mountains was different from what she'd known in the city, there was old Pete at the general store in the nearest town, who'd taught her which supplies were worth the drive and which could be improvised. There was Martha, a widow who lived about 5 miles down the ridge and checked in once a month or so. bringing news from the outside world and carrying back reports that June was still alive and managing on her own. These relationships were built on respect rather than convenience, on genuine concern rather than social obligation. The outside world had kept spinning without her, and June had found she didn't miss it as much as she'd expected. She had a battery-powered radio that picked up news from the valley towns, but she rarely turned it on anymore. The problems of politics and economics and social media drama felt distant and somehow less important than the immediate concerns of mountain life. When would the first frost come? Did she have enough vegetables canned for winter? Was that new sound in the forest something to investigate or something to avoid? This morning, as she stood on her porch watching the mist lift from the valleys below, June felt the same deep satisfaction that had sustained her for 2 decades. She'd built this life with her own hands and wits. She'd proven to herself that she could survive anything, that she was stronger than the world that had tried to break her. The walking stick felt solid and familiar in her hand, a reminder of how far she'd traveled from that broken woman standing at a bus stop in the city. But satisfaction, she'd learned, was different from peace. There was still something restless in her spirit, something that stirred on mornings like this when the mist seemed to carry whispers from deeper in the mountains. She'd always attributed it to the natural human desire for adventure, for discovery, for something beyond the routine of daily survival. Today, that restlessness felt stronger than usual, as if the mountains themselves were trying to tell her something. She finished her coffee and set the mug on the porch railing, ready to begin another day in the rhythm she'd created. But first, she wanted to check the deer trails up near the old ridge. She'd been tracking a small herd for the past week, noting their patterns and feeding areas. Understanding their movements helped her plan her own routes through the forest, avoiding areas where her presence might disrupt their natural behavior. June picked up her walking stick and stepped off the porch, breathing in the clean mountain air that still amazed her after all these years. The day stretched ahead of her, full of small tasks and quiet pleasures. She had no idea that by evening, everything she'd built in these mountains would be threatened by something she'd never imagined. Something that had been waiting for her far longer than she'd been hiding from the world. The deer trail led June higher into the mountains than she'd ventured in months, winding through stands of ancient pines and across rocky outcroppings that offered glimpses of the valleys spread below like a green patchwork quilt. She followed the faint path with practiced ease, her walking stick finding purchase on loose stones and helping her navigate the steeper sections where erosion had carved deep channels in the mountainside. The morning air carried the crisp promise of autumn, though summer still held sway in the lower elevations. Up here, where the wind had more bite and the shadows lingered longer, June could sense the changing season in the way the light fell differently through the canopy, in the subtle shift of bird songs from territorial claims to preparation calls. She'd learned to read these signs over the years, understanding that the mountains spoke in a language older and more reliable than any weather forecast. She paused at a natural clearing where several deer paths converged, studying the ground for signs of recent passage. The soft earth showed hoofprints from the previous evening, along with the scattered droppings that indicated the small herd had spent time here, feeding on the tender shoots that grew in the sun-dappled space. June made mental notes about the timing and size of the group, information that would help her avoid disturbing them while still using the well-worn paths they'd created through the dense forest. It was while she was crouched, examining a particularly clear set of tracks, that she noticed something wrong with the landscape ahead. Through the trees, perhaps 50 yards beyond the clearing, something dark and angular interrupted the natural curves and colors of the forest floor. June straightened slowly, her instincts immediately alert to anything that didn't belong in this familiar environment. She approached cautiously, her walking stick probing the ground ahead of her as she moved through the undergrowth. As she drew closer, the wrongness became more apparent. It was definitely man-made, partially hidden by decades of fallen leaves and the creeping advance of moss and small saplings. but unmistakably artificial in this wild place. When she finally stood over it, June felt her breath catch in her throat. It was a coffin, not the metal and silk monstrosity of modern funeral homes, but an old wooden box made from rough-hewn planks that had weathered to a silver-grey patina. The wood was thick and solid, built to last, though the years had softened its edges and allowed moss to claim portions of its surface. It lay half sunken into the forest floor, as if the earth had been slowly swallowing it over many seasons. June walked around the perimeter, studying it from every angle. There was no headstone, no grave marker of any kind, no indication of who might have been buried here or when. The coffin appeared to be sealed, its lid held in place by what looked like hand-forged iron clasps that had rusted but still held firm. Most disturbing of all, it was positioned with no regard for the slope of the land or the natural drainage patterns. Whoever had placed it here hadn't been concerned with the normal considerations of burial. She knelt beside it, running her fingers along the wood grain and examining the craftsmanship. The joints were tight and well made, the work of someone who understood woodworking and took pride in their skill. But there was something else, something that made her skin prickle with unease. The coffin felt too present, too intact for something that had obviously been here for decades. Wood this old, exposed to mountain weather, should have shown more deterioration. A gust of wind moved through the trees above, and June could have sworn she heard something that sounded almost like whispers in the rustling leaves. She looked up, scanning the canopy, but saw only the normal dance of branches and the play of light and shadow. When she looked back at the coffin, one of the iron clasps seemed to gleam despite its coating of rust, as if it had caught sunlight that wasn't quite reaching anything else. June's rational mind began cataloguing possible explanations. An old family burial plot from the days when people buried their dead on their own land. A forgotten grave from some long-abandoned homestead. Perhaps even something from the Civil War era, when these mountains had seen their share of conflict and hasty burials. But none of these explanations felt right. The location was too remote, too difficult to access for a proper burial. And there was something about the craftsmanship that seemed both very old and somehow timeless. She stood and backed away a few steps, fighting the urge to return to her cabin and pretend she'd never found this thing. But June had learned over her years in the mountains that pretending problems didn't exist was a luxury she couldn't afford. If there was something here that posed a danger to her or to the environment she'd made her home, she needed to understand what it was. The walk back to her cabin took longer than usual, her mind churning through possibilities, and her eyes constantly drawn back over her shoulder toward the ridge where the coffin waited. By the time she reached her porch, she'd made a decision that surprised her with its firmness. She was going to open it. The afternoon was spent gathering tools and working up the courage for what she knew might be a profoundly disturbing experience. She collected her pry bar, work gloves, and a flashlight, along with a canvas tarp in case she needed to cover whatever she found inside. She also brought rope, though she wasn't entirely sure why. Some instinct suggested that she might need to secure something, though she couldn't imagine what. The return trip to the coffin felt different, charged with anticipation and dread in equal measure. The forest seemed quieter than it had been in the morning, as if the usual inhabitants were holding their breath. Even her footsteps sounded muffled, absorbed by the thick carpet of fallen leaves in a way that seemed unnatural. When she reached the site, June was struck again by how out of place the coffin looked. In the afternoon light, with shadows starting to lengthen, it seemed even more like an intrusion into the natural order of things. She set down her tools and took a deep breath, reminding herself that she'd faced unknown challenges before and survived them all. The iron clasps were more corroded than they'd appeared from a distance, but they were also stronger. It took considerable effort with the pry bar to work them loose, and when the first one finally gave way with a sharp crack, June jumped at the sound. The second clasp proved even more stubborn, requiring her to brace her feet and use her full body weight to apply leverage. When both clasps were finally loose, June paused with her hands on the lid. This was the moment of no return. Whatever was inside this coffin had been sealed away for a reason, and she was about to become responsible for that knowledge. But her curiosity had always been stronger than her caution. It was one of the traits that had driven her to success in her previous life and had helped her adapt to mountain living when everything else had fallen apart. She lifted the lid slowly, ready to slam it shut again if necessary. The hinges, surprisingly, moved smoothly despite their age, as if they'd been maintained or oiled recently. As the interior was revealed, June found herself staring at something that made no sense at all. The coffin was not empty, but neither did it contain the bones she'd expected. Instead, it was lined with faded silk that might once have been white, but had aged to the color of old parchment. Nestled in this silk were objects that belonged to no grave she'd ever seen. A small leather journal tied with ribbon, a silver locket that caught the filtered sunlight and threw it back in sharp glints, and most unsettling of all, a photograph in a simple wooden frame. June reached for the photograph with trembling fingers, lifting it carefully from its resting place. The image was sepia-toned and formal in the way of old portraits, showing a young woman dressed in clothing that suggested the late 1800s or early 1900s. The woman's pose was standard for the era, seated, hands folded, expression serious but not unfriendly. What made June's hands shake was the woman's face. It was her own face, or so close to her own that it might have been a twin. The same dark eyes, the same strong jawline, the same slight asymmetry in the eyebrows that June had always considered her most distinguishing feature, even allowing for the differences in clothing and hairstyle. The resemblance was unmistakable and impossible. As she stared at the photograph, a cold wind began to blow through the trees, carrying with it sounds that definitely were not natural forest noises. Whispers, just as she'd imagined earlier, but clearer now and undeniably real. They seemed to come from all directions at once, speaking words she couldn't quite make out, but in tones that suggested both welcome and warning. June looked up from the photograph to find that the forest around her had changed. The light had taken on a strange quality, more silver than gold, and the shadows seemed deeper and more substantial than they should have been with the sun still well above the horizon. Most unsettling of all, she could see figures moving between the trees, indistinct shapes that vanished when she tried to focus on them directly but were clearly present in her peripheral vision. She carefully placed the photograph back in the coffin and reached for the locket, her academic curiosity overriding her growing fear. The silver was tarnished but intact, and when she managed to work the clasp open, she found herself looking at a miniature painting of the same woman from the photograph. But this time there was something else, an inscription on the inside of the locket in tiny, precise script. E. Whitmore, 1887, Whitmore. Her own last name, though she'd never heard of any family history that reached back to the 1800s. Her grandparents had immigrated from Ireland in the 1920s, or so she'd always been told. There were no family stories about ancestors who'd lived in these mountains, no tales of great-great-grandmothers who'd posed for formal portraits in the previous century. The whispers grew louder, and June realized with dawning horror that she could now make out some of the words. They were calling her name, not June, but Elizabeth. The name inscribed in the locket. Over and over, in voices that seemed to come from the earth itself, they repeated, Elizabeth, with an urgency that made her skin crawl. She snapped the locket shut and stood quickly, backing away from the coffin. The movement seemed to break whatever spell had been building, and the forest suddenly returned to normal. The light resumed its natural golden color. The shadows retreated to their proper places, and the whispers faded until they might have been nothing more than wind in the leaves. But June knew what she'd seen and heard. More importantly, she knew what she held in her hand, evidence of something that challenged everything she thought she knew about herself and her family. As she hurried back toward her cabin, the locket clutched tightly in her fist. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched by eyes that had been waiting a very long time for her to find what she'd just discovered. June spent the evening by lamplight, examining the locket with a magnifying glass she used for reading the small print on seed packets and medicine bottles. The silver was definitely old. The patina and wear patterns spoke of decades, possibly centuries of age. The miniature painting inside was exquisite work, the kind of detailed artistry that spoke of considerable expense and care. But it was the inscription that held her attention most. E. Whitmore, 1887. She tried to remember everything her grandmother had told her about their family history. Margaret Whitmore had been a storyteller, full of tales about the old country and the journey to America. But those stories had always focused on her grandfather's side of the family. June's grandmother had been more reticent about her own lineage, often changing the subject when questions turned to her maiden name or her family's origins. At the time, June had assumed it was simply the natural reserve of someone who'd grown up in an era when personal details were kept private. Now, staring at the locket by the flickering light of her oil lamp, June wondered if there had been more deliberate reasons for her grandmother's silence. The name Elizabeth Whitmore suggested a connection through her grandmother's line, but it was a connection that had never been mentioned in any of the family stories she'd grown up hearing. She opened the leather journal she'd also taken from the coffin, handling it carefully as the binding was fragile with age. The pages were filled with entries in the same precise handwriting as the locket inscription, though the ink had faded to brown and some pages were too damaged by moisture to read clearly. The entries that were legible told a strange story of a woman living alone in these same mountains, documenting experiences that sounded disturbingly familiar. "The whispers grow stronger each night," one entry read. "They call to me from the old places, speaking names I almost remember. Mother warned me this day would come, that the calling runs in our blood like a river that cannot be dammed. I have tried to resist, to live a normal life among normal people, but the mountains will not release their claim." Another entry, dated several weeks later, described dreams that made June's skin crawl with recognition. "I see them in my sleep now, the ones who came before. They walk between the trees in forms that shift and change, neither fully alive nor properly dead. They are waiting for something, and I fear that something is me." The burden passes from mother to daughter, grandmother to granddaughter, an unbroken chain of guardianship that stretches back to the first settlements in these hills. June set the journal aside and walked to her kitchen window, looking out into the darkness that surrounded her cabin. The familiar sounds of the night forest, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the whisper of wind through pine branches, suddenly seemed charged with new meaning. How many times over the years had she noticed sounds that didn't quite fit the normal patterns? How often had she glimpsed movement in her peripheral vision that vanished when she turned to look directly? She'd always attributed these experiences to the natural hypervigilance that came with living alone in a wild place. The human mind, she'd reasoned, was designed to detect potential threats, and in the absence of real danger, it sometimes created false alarms. But reading Elizabeth's journal, June began to wonder if her isolation had made her more sensitive to things that were actually present. Things that most people in their busy, noisy lives would never notice. The next morning brought no relief from her growing unease. June's usual breakfast routine felt hollow and performed, her attention constantly drawn to the locket that now sat on her kitchen table like an accusation. She tried to focus on normal tasks, checking her solar panel, inventorying her preserved food stores, planning the day's work, but everything felt different now, as if she was seeing her carefully constructed life through someone else's eyes. It was while she was splitting firewood that the first truly supernatural event occurred. June was working through a pile of oak logs, her movements automatic after years of practice, when she heard her name called clearly from the direction of the forest. Not Elizabeth this time, but June, spoken in a voice that sounded remarkably like her grandmother's. She straightened and looked toward the tree line, her axe still raised.
Hello?
she called back, though she knew no one was there. The sound had been too clear, too close, to be a human voice carrying from any reasonable distance. And there was something about the tone that suggested the speaker was not entirely human. The voice came again, closer this time, definitely from within the trees that bordered her small clearing. "June, child, come to me. There's so much you need to know." June set down her axe and picked up her walking stick, approaching the edge of the forest with caution. The morning sunlight seemed reluctant to penetrate the canopy, leaving the spaces between the trees dim and mysterious. As she drew closer, she could see a figure standing perhaps 20 feet into the woods. A woman in old-fashioned clothing, her face obscured by shadow. "Grandmother," June whispered, though she knew it was impossible. Margaret Whitmore had been dead for 15 years, and even if she hadn't been, she would never have appeared in the middle of the Blue Ridge Mountains wearing what looked like a Victorian-era dress. The figure beckoned to her, and despite every rational instinct screaming warnings, June found herself taking a step forward. Then another. The woman in the shadows seemed familiar in ways that went beyond physical resemblance. As if June's soul recognized something that her mind couldn't process. She was halfway to the figure when a jay began scolding loudly from somewhere overhead, its harsh cry breaking whatever spell had been building. June blinked and found herself standing alone among the trees, with no sign that anyone else had ever been there. The forest floor showed no footprints, no disturbed leaves, nothing to indicate the presence of the woman she'd seen so clearly moments before. June backed away slowly, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and loss. She'd wanted desperately to speak with the figure, to ask the questions that had been building since she'd found the locket. But she also recognized that whatever she'd seen was not her grandmother, not in any conventional sense. It was something else, something that knew her well enough to take a form that would draw her in. The rest of the day passed in a haze of nervous energy and constant vigilance. June found herself starting at every sound, turning to look over her shoulder at movements that weren't there, checking and rechecking the locks on her cabin doors and windows. She'd never felt the need for such security before. In 20 years of mountain living, her greatest concerns had been weather and wildlife, not intruders. But something fundamental had changed, and she no longer felt safe in the sanctuary she'd spent decades creating. That evening, she attempted to contact the outside world using her satellite phone, a piece of technology she kept for genuine emergencies and used perhaps twice a year. She wanted to speak with someone grounded in reality, someone who could help her process what she was experiencing without dismissing her concerns entirely. But when she powered on the device and attempted to place a call, she was met with nothing but static. June checked the battery level, confirmed the antenna position, and tried multiple times to establish a connection. The phone had worked perfectly during her last test 6 months ago, and there was no reason for it to fail now unless she looked up at the clear night sky, unless something was deliberately interfering with the signal. The realization that she might be truly isolated and cut off from any possibility of outside help or advice settled over her like a cold weight. She was alone with whatever forces had begun stirring in response to her discovery of the coffin, alone with questions about her family history that grew more disturbing with each page of Elizabeth's journal she managed to decipher, alone with the growing certainty that her grandmother's untold stories held secrets that might be crucial to her survival. June spent the night reading by lamplight, working her way through the fragile pages of the journal and trying to piece together a coherent picture of what Elizabeth Whitmore had experienced in these same mountains more than a century ago. The entries painted a picture of a woman caught between two worlds, the normal world of human concerns and an older, stranger realm that existed in the spaces between perception and reality. Most troubling were the references to the calling and the hereditary nature of whatever burden Elizabeth had carried. If the journal was accurate, and if June was indeed descended from this woman, then her presence in the mountains might not have been the free choice she'd always believed it to be. The possibility that her entire life had been shaped by forces beyond her understanding or control was almost too much to bear. But as the first light of dawn began to filter through her windows, June made a decision that surprised her with its firmness. Whatever was happening to her, whatever secrets her family had kept for generations, she was going to face it head on. She'd survived corporate betrayal, personal devastation, and 20 years of wilderness living. She would not be driven from her home by whispers and shadows, no matter how supernatural their origin. The first step would be research. If Elizabeth Whitmore had been real, if she'd lived in these mountains and faced similar experiences, then there would be records somewhere. Birth certificates, death certificates, property deeds, the paper trail that every life leaves behind. June had avoided the outside world for 2 decades, but now she realized she would have to venture back into it to find the answers she needed. Tomorrow, she would make the drive to town and visit the county records office. She would search genealogy databases and local historical societies. She would find out exactly who Elizabeth Whitmore had been and what connection existed between them. Armed with facts and documentation, she might be able to understand what was happening to her and, more importantly, what she needed to do about it. The locket sat on her kitchen table as she made these plans, catching the early morning light and throwing it back in patterns that seemed almost like signals. June picked it up and held it to the lamp, studying the miniature painting once more. The woman's eyes seemed to hold secrets, but also something that might have been encouragement. Whatever Elizabeth had faced in her time, she had apparently been strong enough to document it, to leave a record for someone who might follow in her footsteps. June fastened the locket around her neck, feeling the cool weight of the silver against her skin. If she was indeed part of some hereditary burden or calling, then she would meet it with the same determination that had carried her through every other challenge in her life. But first, she needed to understand exactly what she was up against. The drive to town took June through winding mountain roads she'd traveled hundreds of times over the years. But this morning everything felt different. The familiar curves and vistas seemed to watch her with new attention, as if the landscape itself was aware of her mission. She kept the locket tucked safely in her jacket pocket, along with photocopies she'd made of the clearest pages from Elizabeth's journal using an old scanner she'd bought years ago for preserving important documents. Millbrook was the kind of small mountain town that existed primarily to serve the needs of people like June, those who lived in the hills and valleys surrounding it, coming in periodically for supplies, medical care, and contact with the broader world. The main street stretched for perhaps 6 blocks, lined with the practical businesses that kept mountain communities running. A hardware store, a grocery that doubled as a post office, a clinic that was staffed 3 days a week, and a few other establishments that had survived the economic changes that had hollowed out so many rural places. The county records office occupied a corner of the courthouse, a sturdy brick building that had been constructed sometime in the 1940s and maintained with the careful frugality of a community that understood the value of making things last. June had been here before, years ago, to handle the legal details of establishing residency and property rights for her cabin. But she'd never paid much attention to the genealogical resources that the office maintained. Eleanor Hartwell, the records clerk, remembered June from her previous visits and greeted her with the kind of polite interest that small-town people reserved for neighbors they saw infrequently but respected. Eleanor was a woman in her 60s who'd been born and raised in these mountains, the keeper of institutional memory and the person everyone turned to when they needed to trace property lines or settle questions about local history. "What brings you down from the mountains today, June?" Eleanor asked, looking up from a stack of filing that seemed to be her perpetual occupation. "I haven't seen you since you came in about that property survey issue." June had prepared a story that was mostly true, explaining that she'd become interested in researching her family history and had come across some old documents that suggested connections to the area that she hadn't been aware of. She showed Eleanor the photocopied pages from Elizabeth's journal. careful not to mention the more supernatural aspects of what she'd found. Eleanor's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loved genealogical puzzles. "Oh, this is fascinating," she said, adjusting her reading glasses to examine the journal pages more closely. "This handwriting style and the paper quality, I'd say this is definitely from the late 1800s. And Whitmore, that's not a common name in these parts. But I do remember seeing it in some of the older records." She led June to a section of the office that housed historical documents, filing cabinets filled with copies of birth certificates, death certificates, property deeds, and other official records dating back to the county's founding. If your Elizabeth Whitmore lived in this area, there should be some trace of her in these files. The record-keeping wasn't as thorough back then as it is now, but most significant events were documented. The search took the better part of the morning, with Eleanor pulling files and cross-referencing names, while June tried to contain her growing excitement and apprehension. Finally, Eleanor emerged from a filing cabinet with a folder that made her smile with satisfaction. "Found her," she announced, spreading several documents across the counter. "Elizabeth Whitmore, born 1863, died 1889. According to this death certificate, she lived alone in the mountains east of town, which would be right around where your place is now. Cause of death is listed as natural causes, but that was often used when the actual cause was unclear or deemed too sensitive for public record." June studied the documents with growing amazement. The birth certificate listed Elizabeth's parents as Thomas and Mary Whitmore, but what caught her attention was a notation in the margin that she couldn't decipher. Eleanor explained that it was a reference to additional documentation that might be stored in the Historical Society's archives. "Here's what's really interesting," Eleanor continued. "Pulling out a property deed. Elizabeth inherited a substantial piece of land from her parents, several hundred acres in the Blue Ridge foothills. But according to this, she never sold it or passed it on to anyone else. The property went into legal limbo after her death and was eventually classified as abandoned." June felt her heart race as she realized the implications. What happened to abandoned property back then? Eventually it reverted to county ownership, and then it was either sold for taxes or designated as public land. But sometimes, especially with remote mountain property, it just sat there for decades without anyone paying much attention to it. Your cabin might very well be sitting on land that once belonged to Elizabeth Whitmore. The Historical Society occupied a converted Victorian house on the edge of downtown, staffed by volunteers who were passionate about preserving the area's heritage. The president of the society, a retired teacher named Dorothy Chen, welcomed June with the enthusiasm of someone who rarely had visitors interested in the more obscure aspects of local history. "Eleanor called ahead," Dorothy explained, leading June to a research room lined with filing cabinets, bookshelves, and boxes of documents that had been donated over the years. "She said you're researching the Whitmore family. That's a name that comes up in some of our more interesting collections." Dorothy retrieved a large cardboard box from a high shelf, handling it with the care reserved for fragile treasures. "This came to us from the estate of a local family who'd been collecting historical documents for generations. They donated everything they had when the last member of the family moved away. Most of it is routine stuff, property records, business correspondence, that sort of thing. But there are some unusual items mixed in." June watched as Dorothy carefully removed layers of tissue paper to reveal a collection of documents, photographs and personal items that had somehow survived more than a century. Among them was a leather-bound diary that made June's breath catch. It was nearly identical to the journal she'd found in the coffin, though this one was in better condition. "This diary belonged to Mary Whitmore, Elizabeth's mother," Dorothy explained. "It covers the period from 1885 to 1888, right up until Elizabeth's death. Some of the entries are quite disturbing, actually. Mary writes about her daughter experiencing what she called the calling. It and her growing concern about Elizabeth's isolation in the mountains. June opened the diary carefully, scanning the entries that Dorothy indicated. Mary's handwriting was similar to her daughter's, but more hurried, as if written under stress. The entries painted a picture of a mother watching her daughter succumb to forces she didn't understand, but recognized from family history. The women in our family have always been different. One entry read, "My own mother told me stories of my grandmother, who disappeared into the mountains and was never seen again. She said it was our burden, passed down through the bloodline, but I always hoped it would skip Elizabeth. I was wrong." Another entry, dated just weeks before Elizabeth's death, was even more revealing. Elizabeth says she can hear them calling to her. The old ones who were here before the mountains had names. She speaks of responsibilities and guardianship, of things that must be watched and maintained. I fear I am losing her to the same madness that claimed the women before her. Dorothy watched June's face as she read, noting her obvious emotional reaction to the material. "Are you related to the Whitmores?" she asked gently. "You seem to have a personal connection to this material." June nodded, not trusting herself to speak immediately. The evidence was overwhelming. She was clearly descended from this family line, connected to Elizabeth not just by name, but by the same inexplicable calling to the mountains, the same isolation, possibly even the same supernatural experiences that had driven Elizabeth to an early death. "There's more," Dorothy said, retrieving another item from the box. "This is a map that was found among Elizabeth's possessions after she died. It shows locations throughout the Blue Ridge where she marked various sites with symbols we've never been able to interpret. The map was hand-drawn on heavy paper that had yellowed with age, showing the mountain ridges and valleys with remarkable accuracy for the time period. Scattered across the landscape were small symbols, circles, triangles, and crosses, each carefully placed at specific locations. June recognized several of the landmarks, including the ridge where she'd found the coffin. The local folklore has always included stories about these mountains being special in some way, Dorothy continued. Native American legends speak of sacred sites and supernatural guardians. Some of the early settlers reported strange experiences, voices in the forest, lights that moved through the trees at night, areas where compasses wouldn't work properly. June studied the map more closely, noting that many of the marked locations formed a rough pattern across the mountain range. If Elizabeth had been documenting supernatural sites, then the coffin June had found was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. "I'd like to make copies of this material," June said, trying to keep her voice steady. "This family history is more extensive than I realized." Dorothy was happy to accommodate the request. But as they were setting up the copying machine, she mentioned something that made June's blood run cold. "You know, you're not the first person to ask about the Whitmore family recently. We had another researcher here about 6 months ago, someone who claimed to be working on a book about mountain folklore. He was particularly interested in Elizabeth's map and spent quite a bit of time studying it. Did he give you his name?" June asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "I have it somewhere in our visitor log," Dorothy said, flipping through a notebook. "Here it is, Dr. Marcus Thorne. He said he was from a university, though I can't remember which one. Very intense man, asked a lot of specific questions about the marked locations on Elizabeth's map." June felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. The name meant nothing to her, but the timing was suspicious. 6 months ago, she'd begun experiencing the subtle, supernatural events that she'd attributed to her imagination. Sounds in the forest that didn't quite fit, glimpses of movement that vanished when she looked directly. If someone else was researching Elizabeth's map and the locations it marked, it might explain why supernatural activity in the area was increasing. The drive back to her cabin was filled with more questions than answers. June now knew beyond doubt that she was connected to Elizabeth Whitmore, part of a family line that had some kind of hereditary relationship with supernatural forces in the Blue Ridge Mountains. But she also knew that others were aware of this connection, and that her discovery of the coffin might have been part of a larger pattern of activity in the area. As she climbed the winding road toward her ridge, June noticed that the forest seemed different again, more watchful, more alive with potential. The shadows between the trees held shapes that might have been figures, and the wind carried sounds that were almost like voices. Whatever was happening to her was accelerating, building towards something she couldn't yet see, but was beginning to feel in her bones. The locket around her neck seemed heavier as she reached her cabin, as if it was responding to her proximity to whatever forces Elizabeth had dealt with in her time. June touched it through her jacket, drawing what comfort she could from the physical connection to her ancestor. If Elizabeth had faced these challenges alone, at least June now knew she wasn't the first woman in her family to confront the supernatural heritage that came with their bloodline. But she also knew that Elizabeth had died young, alone in these mountains, overcome by forces she'd apparently been unable to master. As June parked her truck and looked up at her cabin, her sanctuary for 20 years, she wondered if she would be strong enough to break a pattern that seemed to have claimed the women in her family for generations. June spread Elizabeth's map across her kitchen table alongside the photocopies of the historical documents, weighing down the corners with coffee mugs to keep the fragile paper flat. In the lamplight, the hand-drawn symbols seemed to pulse with meaning she was only beginning to understand. The circle marked near her own location clearly corresponded to where she'd found the coffin. But there were at least a dozen other symbols scattered across the mountain range, each one potentially marking another supernatural site. She traced the map's contours with her finger, comparing them to her own mental geography of the region. Elizabeth had been remarkably accurate in her cartography. The ridgelines, valleys, and even some of the larger rock formations were depicted with the precision of someone who'd spent years walking these mountains. But it was the symbols that held June's attention most completely. The circles seemed to cluster in specific areas, often near water sources or natural clearings. The triangles were positioned on higher elevations, frequently at points that would offer commanding views of the surrounding landscape. The crosses appeared to follow no obvious pattern, scattered seemingly at random throughout the mapped area. June wondered if each symbol type represented a different kind of supernatural phenomenon, or perhaps different levels of threat or importance. Her speculation was interrupted by a sound that had become disturbingly familiar over the past few days, the whisper of her name carried on wind that didn't seem to be moving any of the trees outside her windows. This time, however, the voice was different. Not the grandmother-like tone she'd heard before, but something younger, more urgent. June. The voice seemed to come from just outside her front door. June, you need to understand what you're dealing with. She approached the door cautiously, her walking stick in hand. Through the small window, she could see a figure standing at the edge of her porchlight's reach, a woman in modern hiking clothes, perhaps in her 30s, with dark hair and an expression of desperate urgency. June opened the door partway, keeping the chain latch engaged. Who are you? My name is Dr. Sarah Chen, the woman said, and June immediately recognized the surname from her visit to the Historical Society. Dorothy is my aunt. She called me after you left today because she was worried about what you might be getting yourself into. How did you get here? June asked, though she was already beginning to suspect this wasn't an ordinary late-night visit. The road to my cabin isn't exactly well marked. Sarah smiled grimly. I've been coming to these mountains since I was a child. My family has been documenting supernatural activity in this region for 3 generations. When Dorothy told me about your research into the Whitmore family, I knew I had to warn you. June studied the young woman's face, noting the intelligence in her eyes and the way she held herself, with the confidence of someone accustomed to being taken seriously despite her age. More importantly, there was something about her presence that felt genuinely human, in a way that the other recent apparitions had not. Warn me about what? About Dr. Marcus Thorne, Sarah said. He's not the academic researcher he pretended to be when he visited the Historical Society. He's something much more dangerous. June unlatched the chain and opened the door fully, stepping aside to let Sarah enter. If this was another supernatural manifestation, it was far more sophisticated than anything she'd encountered so far. But her instincts, honed by 20 years of mountain living, suggested that Sarah Chen was exactly what she appeared to be, a concerned human being with knowledge that June desperately needed. Sarah accepted the invitation gratefully, stamping her feet to shake off the mountain cold. She glanced around June's cabin with obvious appreciation for the craftsmanship and self-sufficiency it represented. But her attention quickly focused on the document spread across the kitchen table. "You found Elizabeth's map," she said, moving toward it with the reverence of someone who understood its significance. "We've been looking for this for years. My grandfather wrote about it in his journals, but we were never sure it actually existed." "Your grandfather?" "Dr. James Chen, though he went by Jimmy in these mountains. He came here in the 1940s to study folklore and ended up spending the rest of his life documenting supernatural phenomena. He was convinced that the Blue Ridge contained what he called thin places, locations where the barrier between our world and something else was naturally weak." Sarah pulled out a chair and sat across from June, her eyes never leaving the map. "My grandfather believed that certain families, bloodlines with specific genetic or spiritual characteristics, were naturally sensitive to these thin places. He thought they were drawn to them, compelled to serve as guardians or sentries against whatever exists on the other side." June felt her mouth go dry. The calling that Elizabeth wrote about. Exactly. My grandfather documented at least 6 families over the past century who showed the same pattern. Women drawn to isolated areas in the mountains, experiencing supernatural phenomena, often dying young under mysterious circumstances. The Whitmore family was one of his primary case studies. Sarah reached into her backpack and pulled out a thick folder. "This is everything my grandfather collected about your family line. Birth records, death certificates, newspaper clippings, even some photographs. He was obsessed with proving that the calling wasn't just folklore or mental illness, but a genuine supernatural phenomenon." June opened the folder with trembling hands, finding herself looking at documentation that went back even further than what she'd discovered at the Historical Society. There were records of Margaret Whitmore, Elizabeth's mother, and her mother before her, Sarah Whitmore, who died in 1855 under circumstances described as unexplained by the local newspaper. "It goes back at least 5 generations, Sarah continued. "Always women, always drawn to the same general area of the mountains, always experiencing what they described as voices or callings that others couldn't hear. My grandfather believed they were being recruited by something that needed human agents to maintain barriers or seals of some kind. Recruited or compelled? That was the question he never managed to answer. Did these women choose their fate, or were they victims of something that used their genetic sensitivity against them?" Sarah leaned forward, her expression intense. "But here's what's really important. 6 months ago, Dr. Marcus Thorne came to my aunt asking about the Whitmore family. He showed her credentials from a university that doesn't exist and asked very specific questions about Elizabeth's map and the locations it marked." June felt the familiar chill of supernatural presence, but this time it seemed to emanate from the conversation itself rather than from any external source. "What kind of questions?" "He wanted to know if anyone from the Whitmore bloodline was still alive. He asked about property records and whether anyone currently lived in the areas Elizabeth had marked on her map. When my aunt mentioned that a woman named June Whitmore had been researching her family history, his interest became very intense. The implications hit June like a physical blow. He knows I'm here." "More than that," Sarah said grimly. "I think he's been watching you for months, possibly years. The timing of your supernatural experiences coinciding with his research isn't a coincidence. I think he's been deliberately stirring up activity in the areas marked on Elizabeth's map, trying to force whoever inherited the calling to reveal themselves." June stood and walked to her window, looking out into the darkness that suddenly seemed full of threats she hadn't recognized. "But why? What does he want? That's where my grandfather's research gets really disturbing." Sarah said, pulling out another set of documents. He believed that the thin places your ancestors guarded were actually prisons, locations where dangerous entities from another realm had been trapped or sealed away. If someone wanted to release those entities, they would need someone with the hereditary sensitivity to act as a key. The map on June's table seemed to glow more brightly in the lamplight, its symbols appearing to shift and move when she wasn't looking directly at them. She thought about the coffin she found, the items inside that had belonged to Elizabeth, the increasing supernatural activity around her cabin. Everything had started when she'd opened that coffin and taken the locket. The locket, she whispered, touching it through her shirt. It's not just a memento, is it? Sarah's expression grew even more grave. My grandfather wrote about ceremonial objects that were passed down through guardian bloodlines. Items that served as both symbols of inherited responsibility and actual tools for maintaining supernatural barriers. If you're wearing something that belonged to Elizabeth, it might be actively affecting your sensitivity to whatever forces exist in these mountains. As if summoned by their conversation, a sound began to emanate from somewhere deep in the forest around June's cabin. It started as a low hum, barely audible above the normal night sounds, but gradually grew in volume and complexity until it resembled a chorus of voices singing in a language that predated any human tongue. Both women stood frozen, listening to the otherworldly melody that seemed to come from all directions at once. The sound was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, alien yet somehow familiar, as if it was something June had been hearing in her dreams for years without recognizing it. "It's starting," Sarah whispered. "Whatever Thorn has been trying to accomplish, you opening that coffin and taking the locket has accelerated the process. The barriers are weakening." June felt the locket grow warm against her skin, then hot enough to be uncomfortable. When she pulled it out to examine it, the silver was glowing with a soft light that pulsed in rhythm with the singing from the forest. The miniature painting of Elizabeth seemed to be moving, her eyes turning to look directly at June with an expression of urgent warning. "We need to get you away from here," Sarah said, moving toward the door. "My family has a safe house in town, protected by symbols and rituals my grandfather developed. You can't face this alone." But even as she spoke, the singing grew louder and more insistent, and June found herself reluctant to move away from the map and documents spread across her table. There was something she needed to understand, some pattern or connection that was almost within her grasp. The locket's warmth was no longer uncomfortable, but oddly comforting, as if it was trying to communicate something essential. "I can't leave," June said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "Not yet. There's something I need to figure out first." Sarah looked at her with a mixture of admiration and concern. "The calling. You're feeling it now, aren't you? The compulsion to stay and face whatever's coming." June nodded, unable to deny what was becoming increasingly obvious. The same force that had drawn her ancestors to these mountains was now working on her, but with a strength and clarity that suggested the situation had moved beyond the gradual awakening described in Elizabeth's journal. Something was accelerating the process, forcing her to confront her hereditary responsibilities whether she felt ready or not. The singing from the forest reached a crescendo and then stopped abruptly, leaving a silence that felt heavy with anticipation. In that silence, June could hear something else, the sound of vehicles climbing the mountain road toward her cabin. Multiple engines moving slowly but steadily through the darkness. "Thorn," Sarah breathed. "He's coming!" The sound of approaching vehicles grew closer, accompanied by the occasional flash of headlights cutting through the trees along the winding road. June moved to extinguish her oil lamps, plunging the cabin into darkness, while Sarah quickly gathered the most important documents from the table and stuffed them into her backpack. "How many people would he bring?" June whispered, peering through the window toward the road. "My grandfather's notes suggested that Thorn works with a small team, maybe 3 or 4 people who share his interests in supernatural manipulation." Sarah replied, checking her own flashlight and adjusting her pack. But the real danger isn't from his human associates. It's from whatever entities he might have already awakened or brought with him. June felt the locket pulse against her chest with increasing intensity, its silver growing so warm that it was beginning to burn her skin through her shirt. When she touched it, images flashed through her mind, glimpses of Elizabeth standing in this same cabin, facing a similar threat, preparing for a confrontation that would ultimately claim her life. But the images also showed her something else. A hidden compartment built into the cabin's stone foundation, concealed behind what appeared to be a solid wall. Elizabeth had prepared for this day, or one like it, and had left resources for whoever came after her. "There's something hidden in the cabin," June said, moving toward the back wall where she'd seen the compartment in her vision. "Elizabeth left something for me." She ran her hands along the stones, searching for the mechanism that would reveal the hidden space. Her fingers found a stone that moved slightly when pressed, and with a soft grinding sound, a section of the wall swung inward to reveal a narrow alcove. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather that had protected them from decades of moisture, were items that made June's breath catch. There was another journal, this one bound in metal clasps that looked like they were made from the same material as the coffin's fittings. A set of what appeared to be iron chains, their links inscribed with symbols that seemed to shift and move in the dim light. And most significant of all, a wooden staff similar to June's walking stick, but carved with intricate patterns and fitted with metal caps at both ends. "Those are binding chains," Sarah breathed, recognizing the artifacts from her grandfather's descriptions. "They're used to contain supernatural entities that can't be destroyed. And that staff, it's a guardian's tool designed to channel and focus inherited abilities." June lifted the staff carefully, surprised by how natural it felt in her hands. The moment she gripped it, her walking stick, which she'd left leaning against the kitchen table, began to glow with the same soft light that emanated from the locket. The two pieces seemed to be responding to each other, resonating with a frequency that made her bones vibrate. "Your walking stick," Sarah said, staring at the glowing wood. "You made it yourself, didn't you? From oak that you found in these mountains?" June nodded, beginning to understand that her choice of materials and design 20 years ago might not have been as random as she'd believed. "The tree came down in a storm my first winter here. It felt like the right wood to use. It was the right wood because you were already responding to the calling, even then. Your instincts guided you to create a tool that would serve you when the time came to accept your role as a guardian." The sound of car doors slamming came from the direction of the road, followed by voices speaking in low, urgent tones. June estimated that they had perhaps 10 minutes before Thorne and his team reached the cabin, assuming they followed the path rather than attempting to approach through the forest in darkness. She gathered the artifacts from the hidden compartment, amazed by how light the chains felt, despite their obvious strength. The metal was warm to the touch and seemed to hum with contained energy. The journal's metal clasps opened easily at her touch, as if they recognized her genetic signature. The first pages of this journal were written in Elizabeth's familiar handwriting, but the tone was different from the personal diary June had found in the coffin. This was a manual, a guide for whoever would inherit the Guardian's responsibilities. "If you are reading this, then the awakening has begun, and you must prepare for what our family has faced for generations. The entities contained in the marked locations are not evil in the way humans understand evil, but they are dangerous to our reality. They exist in a realm where physical laws are different, where thought and desire can reshape matter itself. If they were to enter our world freely, the changes they would bring would make human life impossible." June read quickly, absorbing the essential information as Sarah kept watch at the window. The journal explained that the Guardian bloodline possessed a genetic mutation that allowed them to perceive and interact with supernatural forces that most humans couldn't detect. This sensitivity made them natural wardens for the prison sites marked on Elizabeth's map. But it also made them vulnerable to manipulation by those who understood their abilities. Each generation. One woman inherits the full calling, June read aloud. She is drawn to the mountains not by choice, but by biological imperative, compelled to maintain the barriers that keep our reality stable. The tools of guardianship, staff, chains, and key, are passed down through the bloodline, becoming more powerful with each generation of use. Sarah looked up from her watch. Key, is that what the locket is? June touched the pendant, feeling its warmth pulse in response. It must be. Elizabeth called it the master key in one of the entries I read earlier. But a key to what? The answer came from Elizabeth's journal. The master key opens all containment sites, but it also serves as the final lock. In the hands of a true guardian, it can reinforce the barriers that hold the entities. In the wrong hands, it can release them all simultaneously. This is why the guardian must be willing to sacrifice everything, including her life, to prevent the key from being misused. The implications hit June like a physical blow. She wasn't just inheriting a role as a supernatural warden. She was becoming the single point of failure for a system that protected human reality from forces that could destroy it. No wonder the women in her family line had died young. The pressure of such responsibility, combined with the isolation it required, would be enough to break anyone. I can see lights through the trees, Sarah whispered urgently. They're almost here. June closed the journal and secured it in her jacket along with the locket. She took the staff in one hand and her glowing walking stick in the other, surprised by how natural it felt to hold both pieces simultaneously. The chains she draped over her shoulder, where they seemed to arrange themselves automatically into a comfortable carrying position. We need to get to the other marked locations before Thorn does, she said, making a decision that surprised her with its clarity. If he's been weakening the barriers at multiple sites, then I need to reinforce them before the entities break free. Sarah stared at her. That would mean traveling to at least a dozen locations scattered across 50 miles of mountain terrain, most of them accessible only on foot. Even if we could move that quickly, we'd be walking into supernatural activity at every site. Then that's what we do, June replied, feeling the certainty that came with accepting an inherited purpose. Elizabeth's journal says the barriers are interconnected. If too many fail simultaneously, the entire system collapses. I can't let that happen. The first flashlight beams became visible through the cabin windows, casting moving shadows across the walls. Thorn's team was spreading out, surrounding the building with the methodical approach of people who'd done this before. June gathered supplies quickly. Water, emergency food, her satellite phone, even though it wasn't working, and a first aid kit. Sarah added items from her own pack, including maps of the region and what appeared to be protective charms made from silver and carved wood. There's a back way out through the root cellar, June said, leading Sarah to a trapdoor she'd installed years ago as a storage space, but which connected to an old mine shaft that emerged about 100 yards from the cabin. It'll put us in the forest without them seeing us leave. As they prepared to descend into the cellar, a voice called out from the darkness around the cabin. It was cultured and confident, with the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Miss Whitmore," the voice said, and June knew without being told that this was Dr. Marcus Thorn. "I know you're in there, and I know you've recently discovered some interesting family heirlooms. I'd like to discuss a business proposition that I think you'll find compelling." June paused at the trapdoor, curiosity warring with caution. Part of her wanted to understand what Thorn hoped to gain from releasing the contained entities. What could possibly be worth risking the destruction of human reality? "June," Sarah whispered urgently, "don't listen to him. My grandfather wrote about this. Thorn uses persuasion and psychological manipulation as much as supernatural force. He'll try to convince you that releasing the entities would be beneficial, or that you don't have the strength to maintain the barriers. I'm not interested in destroying your world." "Miss Whitmore," Thorn continued, his voice carrying easily through the cabin walls, "I'm interested in expanding it. The entities you've been taught to fear are actually sources of immense power and knowledge. They could solve every human problem. Disease, hunger, death itself could become things of the past. All they require is a willing guardian to open the gates between worlds. June felt the locket grow almost painfully hot against her skin, as if it was reacting to Thorn's words with alarm. The staff in her hand began to vibrate, and she could sense supernatural activity building around the cabin, not just from Thorn's presence, but from the entities themselves, responding to the possibility of release. "The choice is yours," Thorn called. "Work with me willingly, and you'll have power beyond imagination. Resist, and I'll take the key from your corpse and use it myself. Either way, the barriers will fall tonight." June looked at Sarah, seeing her own determination reflected in the younger woman's eyes. Whatever Thorn promised, whatever power he offered, it came at the cost of everything she'd spent her life protecting. The mountains that had sheltered her, the simple life she'd built, the world where people like Sarah could pursue knowledge without fear. All of it would be lost if she surrendered to the calling's dark alternative. "Let's go," she said, opening the trapdoor. "We have barriers to reinforce and a madman to stop." As they descended into the cellar, June heard Thorn's voice change from persuasive to commanding. He was giving orders to his team, preparing for a direct assault on the cabin. But by the time they broke down her door, she and Sarah would be deep in the forest, moving toward the first of the marked locations on Elizabeth's map. The underground passage was narrow and damp, carved through rock by miners who'd worked these mountains decades before June was born. It led steadily downward for about 50 yards before beginning to angle back toward the surface. When they finally emerged from the hidden exit, they were well beyond the circle of light cast by Thorn's vehicles, concealed among the thick stand of pines that June had always appreciated for the privacy they provided. From their position, they could see the cabin clearly. Thorn's team consisted of 4 people, all dressed in dark clothing and carrying equipment that looked more military than academic. They moved with practiced efficiency, surrounding the building and preparing for coordinated entry. June felt a pang of loss as she watched strangers approach the home she'd built with her own hands. But the feeling was quickly replaced by anger. These people had invaded her sanctuary, threatened her peace, and were planning to use her genetic heritage to unleash forces that could destroy everything she cared about. The master key pulsed against her chest, and for the first time since she'd put it on, the sensation felt like encouragement rather than warning. Elizabeth had faced a similar situation and had managed to maintain the barriers long enough to pass the tools and knowledge to the next generation. June would have to do better. She would have to permanently stop the threat that Thorn represented while strengthening the supernatural prison system, enough to last for generations to come. The first step was reaching the nearest marked location on Elizabeth's map. According to the journal, each site required a specific ritual to reinforce its barriers, using the Guardian's staff and chains in combination with the master key. If she could strengthen even a few of the most critical sites, it might be enough to prevent a complete system failure. As Thorn's team reached her front door, June turned away from the cabin and started into the deeper forest, Sarah close behind her. The real work was just beginning. The forest at night was a different world, filled with sounds and shadows that took on new meaning now that June understood her supernatural heritage. Every rustle of leaves might hide an awakening entity. Every shift in the wind could carry whispers from the imprisoned forces that sensed the possibility of freedom. She led Sarah through paths she'd walked countless times during her 20 years in the mountains. But now those familiar routes felt like passages through a landscape that was fundamentally unstable. They'd been hiking for nearly an hour when Sarah stopped abruptly, her hand catching June's arm. "Listen," she whispered. In the distance, they could hear the sound of pursuit, voices calling back and forth, the crash of bodies moving through underbrush, the occasional flash of artificial light cutting through the trees. Thorn's team had discovered their escape route and was following there. trail with determination and resources that suggested they'd come prepared for exactly this scenario. How are they tracking us so easily? June asked, though she was beginning to suspect the answer. Sarah pulled out her grandfather's journal and flipped to a section she'd marked earlier. According to this, people with supernatural sensitivity leave traces that can be followed by those who know what to look for. The stronger your connection to the otherworld forces, the more visible your trail becomes to others with similar abilities. June touched the locket through her shirt, feeling its warmth pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat. It's getting stronger, isn't it? The calling. Every step you take toward accepting your role as a guardian makes you more sensitive to supernatural forces, Sarah confirmed. But it also makes you more detectable to those who would use your abilities for their own purposes. They resumed hiking, moving as quickly as they dared through terrain that was treacherous enough in daylight and potentially deadly in darkness. June used her glowing walking stick to navigate, while Sarah followed close behind with her own flashlight set to its dimmest setting. The supernatural tools that June carried seemed to make their passage easier. Branches that should have caught on the chains moved aside without resistance, and loose stones that could have caused a dangerous fall remained stable under their feet. According to Elizabeth's map, the nearest marked location was about 2 miles northeast of June's cabin, situated on a ridge that overlooked a valley where a creek had carved a deep ravine through the bedrock. June had hiked to that area many times over the years, drawn by the natural beauty of the waterfalls and the wildlife that gathered near the permanent water source. Now she understood that her repeated visits to that location hadn't been random. She'd been unconsciously checking on one of the supernatural prison sites she was destined to. God, they were perhaps halfway to their destination when June began to notice changes in the forest around them. The normal night sounds of insects and small animals grew quieter, replaced by something that was almost like music, a low harmonic resonance that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. The trees ahead of them showed signs of supernatural influence, leaves that glowed with their own light, bark that seemed to shift and flow like liquid, branches that moved against the wind in patterns that suggested intention rather than natural forces. "We're getting close to a barrier site," Sarah observed, consulting her grandfather's notes. "The supernatural influence becomes visible when the containment is weakening." June felt the staff in her hand grow warm and begin to vibrate with increasing intensity. The chains across her shoulder seemed to lighten, as if they were eager to be used for their intended purpose. Most significantly, the locket around her neck became so hot that she had to pull it outside her shirt to prevent it from burning her skin. When she looked at the pendant in the dim light of her walking stick, June gasped. The miniature painting of Elizabeth was moving, not just the subtle animation she'd noticed before, but clear, deliberate gestures. Elizabeth was pointing towards something ahead of them and mouthing words that June couldn't quite make out. "Sarah," she whispered, holding the locket where the other woman could see it. "Look at this." Sarah's eyes widened as she watched the painting move. "My grandfather wrote about this. The guardian tools become more active as they approach sites where their power is needed. Elizabeth is trying to warn you about something." June studied Elizabeth's gestures more carefully, trying to interpret the urgent signals her ancestor was making. Elizabeth seemed to be indicating that they should approach the barrier site from a different direction, avoiding the most direct route in favor of a path that would bring them to higher ground. "She's warning us about an ambush," June realized. "Thorn's people aren't just following us, they're trying to get to the barrier site first." They altered their course, climbing toward a ridge that would allow them to observe the marked location before approaching it directly. The change in elevation made the hike more difficult, but it also gave them a strategic advantage that June's military-trained ancestors would have appreciated. When they finally reached a vantage point that overlooked the barrier site, June's worst fears were confirmed. Thorne's team had indeed reached the location ahead of them, and they were already at work on some kind of complex ritual. They'd set up battery-powered lights that illuminated the entire area, revealing details that made June's blood run cold. The barrier site was centered around what appeared to be a natural stone circle, weathered by centuries, but still clearly artificial in its perfect symmetry. Within the circle, the ground showed signs of supernatural disturbance, patches of earth that seemed to ripple like water, areas where the grass grew in impossible colors, and a central depression, where something dark and viscous seeped up from underground. Thorn himself stood at the edge of the circle, consulting what looked like Elizabeth's map while directing his associates in the placement of metal objects around the perimeter. The objects were clearly designed to disrupt, rather than reinforce, whatever supernatural barriers existed at the site. Instead of containing the otherworld forces, they seemed intended to amplify and focus them. "He's not trying to release the entities gradually," Sarah whispered, studying the scene through binoculars her grandfather had modified with special lenses. "He's attempting to create a controlled breach, a way to access otherworld power without completely losing the ability to contain it." June felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "That's not how it works, is it?" According to Elizabeth's journal, the barriers are all or nothing. You can't partially release something that exists outside normal reality. My grandfather believed that was exactly the kind of arrogance that made Thorn dangerous, Sarah replied. He thinks he can control forces that have been imprisoned precisely because they can't be controlled. As they watched, one of Thorn's associates activated a device that began emitting a high-pitched whine. The sound seemed to resonate with the stone circle, causing the dark seepage in the center to bubble more vigorously. The supernatural disturbances around the site grew more pronounced, and June could see shapes moving beneath the rippling patches of earth, things that were trying to push their way up from whatever realm lay below. "We need to stop them now," June said. But as she started to move toward the site, Sarah caught her arm. "Wait," Sarah said urgently. "There's something wrong with this whole situation." June paused, studying the scene more carefully. Sarah was right. Something about Thorn's operation felt off. For all his apparent preparation and resources, his approach to breaching the barrier seemed almost crude, as if he was missing some crucial element that would make his ritual truly effective. He doesn't have everything he needs, June realized. He's trying to force the barrier open without the proper tools. Sarah nodded grimly. "Which means this entire operation is a trap. He's not trying to release the entities here. He's trying to force you to reveal yourself by threatening to do something that would damage the barrier system." The realization hit June like a physical blow. Thorn knew that a guardian would be compelled to intervene if supernatural prison sites were threatened. By staging an apparent attempt to breach the barriers, he was guaranteeing that June would come to him, bringing the master key and the other guardian tools directly into his hands. "But if he damages the barrier, even as a bluff," June said, "he could weaken it enough to cause real problems." As if in response to her words, the device Thorn was using suddenly increased its output, and the stone circle began to glow with an eerie light. The dark seepage in the center erupted upward like a geyser, spraying what looked like liquid shadow across the surrounding area. Where the substance landed, the natural world began to change. Grass turned to crystal, rocks became translucent, and the air itself took on a quality that hurt to look at directly. "That's not a bluff," Sarah breathed. "He's actually breaching the barrier." June felt the master key burn against her chest as it responded to the supernatural emergency below. The locket was reacting to the breakdown of containment, trying to fulfill its function as a stabilizing force. But at this distance, and without the proper ritual preparations, its power was insufficient to counteract what Thorn was doing. She stood, hefting the guardian's staff and preparing to descend toward the site. "I have to stop him, even if it's a trap." "June, wait." Sarah grabbed her arm again, but this time her expression showed excitement rather than caution. "Look at your locket." June looked down and saw that the miniature painting of Elizabeth had changed again. Instead of pointing toward the barrier site, Elizabeth was now gesturing toward something behind them. When June turned to look, she saw a figure approaching through the trees. an elderly man, moving with surprising agility despite his obvious age. "Who is that?" June whispered. Sarah raised her binoculars and then smiled with relief. "It's Tommy Patterson. He's lived in these mountains longer than anyone, and my grandfather always suspected he knew more about the supernatural sights than he ever admitted." The old man reached their position and crouched beside them, studying the scene below with experienced eyes. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who'd been dealing with supernatural crises for decades. "That fool Thorne thinks he's opening a door," Tommy said quietly. "What he's actually doing is ringing a dinner bell. Every entity contained in every site across these mountains can sense what's happening here. If he succeeds in creating a stable breach, they'll all start pushing against their own barriers simultaneously." June studied the weathered mountain man with new understanding. "You've been watching over the sites too, haven't you?" Tommy nodded grimly. "My family's been guardians of a different sort for 4 generations. Not blessed with the sensitivity that runs in your bloodline, but called to serve as protectors and guides for those who are. When I felt the supernatural activity start increasing 6 months ago, I knew it meant a Whitmore woman was finally coming into her power." Sarah consulted her grandfather's notes with growing excitement. "You're mentioned in here, Thomas Patterson, keeper of the old ways. Holder of knowledge that bridges the gap between human understanding and otherworld reality." "Your grandfather was a good man," Tommy said. "He understood that some knowledge is too dangerous to write down completely, so he left pieces of the truth scattered across different sources. The real secret of the Guardian system isn't in any single journal or map." June felt her heart sink as she realized the implications. "The locket isn't the only key. The master key opens all the sites," Tommy confirmed, "but it can only do so safely when used in conjunction with knowledge that's been passed down orally through both our bloodlines. The Whitmores inherited the sensitivity and the tools, but the Pattersons inherited the protocols and safeguards. Below them, Thorne's device reached a new level of intensity, and the barrier around the stone circle began to show visible cracks. Dark lines that spread across the ground like a spiderweb of contained chaos. The entities trapped beneath were clearly responding to the weakening containment, their attempts to break free causing the earth itself to buckle and shift. "How long do we have before he creates an irreversible breach?" June asked. Tommy studied the pattern of cracks with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen this kind of supernatural emergency before. "Maybe 10 minutes before the barrier fails completely. After that, it won't matter if we stop him. The damage will cascade to other sites faster than we can reinforce them." June felt the weight of inherited responsibility settle on her shoulders like a physical burden. 4 generations of women in her family had died protecting these barriers, and now the fate of the entire system rested on decisions she would make in the next few minutes. The master key burned against her chest, eager to fulfill its purpose. But she finally understood that using it incorrectly could be worse than not using it at all. "Tell me what I need to know," she said to Tommy, her voice steady despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. Tommy pulled a small leather pouch from his jacket and opened it to reveal what looked like ordinary river stones, each one carved with symbols that matched those on the Guardian's chains. "These are the counterpart to your inherited tools, stabilizers that have been prepared by my family for generations, waiting for the day when they would be needed." He began explaining the ritual required to properly reinforce a barrier site, his words carrying the cadence of something that had been memorized and passed down through oral tradition. The process was complex, requiring precise placement of the stabilizing stones, specific invocations spoken in the old language of the mountains, and the coordinated use of all 3 Guardian tools, staff, chains, and key. "But here's the crucial part," Tommy continued, his expression growing grave. "The ritual requires a blood sacrifice from the Guardian bloodline. Not death, necessarily, but a significant offering that binds the Guardian to the site permanently. Elizabeth's mother wrote about this in her diary. Every woman who successfully reinforces a barrier site becomes tied to it for life, able to sense threats to its integrity from anywhere in the world, but unable to travel far from the network of sites without weakening them. All June understood now why. The women in her family had died young and alone in these mountains. It wasn't just the stress of supernatural responsibility. It was the gradual weakening that came from being tied to sites that were under constant pressure, from the forces they contained. Each successful barrier reinforcement extended the Guardian's sensitivity but shortened her natural lifespan. "There's something else," Sarah said, flipping through her grandfather's journal to a section she'd marked. According to this, the current generation faces a unique challenge. The barriers were established using 19th century understanding of supernatural forces, but the entities have been adapting and evolving during their imprisonment. They're stronger now, more cunning, and they've learned to work together in ways that the original Guardians never anticipated. Below them, Thorne's equipment reached critical intensity, and June could see things beginning to emerge from the cracks in the barrier, not the entities themselves, but extensions of their influence, tendrils of otherworld energy that began reshaping the physical environment around the stone circle. Trees aged decades in seconds, rocks melted and reformed into impossible geometries, and the air itself took on properties that made it difficult to breathe. He's not just breaching one site, June realized with growing horror. He's destabilizing the entire network. Tommy nodded grimly. This was always the nightmare scenario, someone with enough knowledge to threaten the system, but not enough wisdom to understand the consequences. If the network fails, every entity contained across the Blue Ridge will be released simultaneously. June felt the master key pulse against her chest with increasing urgency. The locket was designed to respond to threats to the barrier system, and it was currently detecting a crisis that demanded immediate action. But she also understood that rushing into Thorne's trap without proper preparation would only make the situation worse. "Can we reinforce multiple sites simultaneously?" she asked. Tommy considered the question carefully. "Not in the traditional way, but there is something mentioned in the oldest stories, a ritual called the Great Binding that was used once before when the entire system was threatened. It requires the Guardian to temporarily merge her consciousness with the network itself, using her sensitivity to stabilize all sites at once. What's the cost? The Guardian who performs the Great Binding becomes permanently integrated into the barrier system. She doesn't die in the conventional sense, but she can never return to normal human existence. She becomes a living component of the supernatural network, aware of every threat to every site, responsible for maintaining the balance between worlds for as long as the barriers exist. June looked down at Thorne's operation, where the cracks in the barrier had widened enough to allow glimpses of the realm beyond, a place where physics worked differently, where thought and reality intermingled in ways that would drive most humans insane. The entities trapped there were ancient beyond human comprehension, powerful beyond human imagination, and utterly alien to human values and concerns. "How do I perform the Great Binding?" Sarah grabbed her arm desperately. "June, you can't. There has to be another way." But Tommy was already reaching into his pouch, pulling out items that had been waiting for this moment for generations. "The ritual is complex, but the principle is simple. The Guardian uses the master key to open temporary connections to all barrier sites simultaneously, then channels her own life force through the network to reinforce every containment field at once." He handed her a small vial filled with what looked like liquid starlight. "This is concentrated essence from the barrier stones themselves, prepared by my great-grandfather when he first sensed that the network might one day face a crisis of this magnitude. It will amplify your sensitivity enough to reach every site in the system, but it will also burn through your human limitations in the process." June took the vial, feeling its warmth through the glass. Around her neck, The master key pulsed with anticipation, recognizing the proximity of the catalyst that would allow it to fulfill its ultimate purpose. In her hands, the guardian staff and chains hummed with energy, eager to be used in the ritual they were designed for. Below them, Thorn's breach widened further, and the first entity began to push through, a shape that hurt to look at directly, composed of angles that shouldn't exist and colors that had no names. Its emergence sent shockwaves through the supernatural network, and June could feel other barriers beginning to weaken in response. "There's no more time for debate," she said, uncorking the vial. "If I don't act now, the entire system fails and Thorn gets what he wants anyway." But as she raised the vial to her lips, a voice called out from the darkness behind them, a voice she recognized from her grandmother's stories, though she'd never heard it spoken aloud. "Elizabeth," the voice said, and June turned to see a figure approaching through the trees. It was her grandmother, Margaret Whitmore, looking exactly as she had 20 years ago, when June had last seen her alive. "Grandmother?" June whispered, though she knew this couldn't be the woman who'd raised her. "Not your grandmother." "Child," the figure replied, and as it drew closer, June could see that it was actually Elizabeth herself, somehow present in a form that was both spirit and substance. "I'm the part of her that carried our family's true heritage. The knowledge that was passed down to her, but which she chose not to share." Tommy stepped back respectfully, recognizing the presence of someone who existed on a different level of reality. Sarah lowered her grandfather's journal, understanding that she was witnessing something that no amount of academic research could have prepared her for. "You have a choice, June," Elizabeth continued, her voice carrying the weight of generations. "You can perform the great binding and save the network, but lose yourself in the process. Or you can accept a different kind of transformation, one that will make you powerful enough to face Thorn directly and establish a new kind of barrier system, one that's designed to handle the evolved threats that the entities now represent." June felt the vial grow heavier in her hand as she realized that her decision in the next few moments would determine not just her own fate, but the future of the supernatural protection that had kept humanity safe for over a century. "What kind of transformation?" Elizabeth smiled with an expression that mixed love and sorrow in equal measure. "The same one I chose when I faced this crisis in my time. I didn't die, June. I became something else, a guardian who exists between worlds, able to operate in both human reality and the otherworld realm. But the transformation can only be passed to one person per generation, and I've been waiting a very long time for someone strong enough to inherit it." Below them, Thorn's breach reached critical mass, and entities began pouring through in numbers that made June's heart race with terror. The time for careful consideration had run out. She had to choose now, and live with the consequences of her decision for whatever remained of her existence. June stared at Elizabeth's spectral form, the weight of an impossible choice pressing down on her like the entire mountain range. Below them, entities continued to pour through Thorn's breach, their alien forms beginning to spread across the landscape and corrupt everything they touched. The normal forest was transforming into something from a nightmare. Trees that grew in spirals that hurt to look at, grass that moved with predatory intent, and air that shimmered with colors that shouldn't exist. "If I accept the transformation," June asked, "what happens to me? Do I remain myself, or do I become something else entirely?" Elizabeth's form flickered like candlelight in a wind, her expression showing the strain of maintaining physical presence in the human world. "You remain yourself, but expanded. You'll gain the ability to exist in both realms simultaneously, to fight the entities on their own terms, while still protecting the human world you love. But you'll also become responsible for maintaining the balance between worlds for as long as you choose to exist. And if I choose the great binding instead, the network stabilizes, the current crisis ends, but the underlying problem remains unsolved. The entities have evolved beyond what the original barriers can contain indefinitely. Eventually, another crisis will arise, and whoever inherits the calling after you may not have the resources to handle it. Tommy stepped forward, his weathered face grave with understanding. Miss June, I've seen what happened to the other sites over the past 6 months. Whatever Thorn did to weaken them, it's accelerated the entity's development. They're not just trying to escape anymore, they're actively working to corrupt the barrier system from within. Sarah consulted her grandfather's journal, flipping to a section she'd marked earlier. There are references here to entity behavior changes that started about 50 years ago. They began communicating across sites, sharing information about human psychology and supernatural theory. They've been preparing for this moment. June felt the master key pulse against her chest with increasing intensity, as if it was responding to the proximity of a decision that would determine its ultimate purpose. The pendant had grown so hot that it was almost painful to wear, but she knew that removing it now would sever her connection to the Guardian network at the moment when that connection was most crucial. "How long do I have to decide?" she asked Elizabeth. "Look at the breach," Elizabeth replied, gesturing toward Thorn's operation. Below, June followed her ancestor's gaze and saw that the supernatural corruption was spreading faster than she'd realized. The entities weren't just emerging from the stone circle. They were using their otherworld abilities to establish footholds throughout the surrounding area. Each foothold became a secondary breach point, creating a cascade effect that was rapidly expanding beyond Thorn's ability to control. "He's lost control of the situation," Tommy observed. That equipment of his was designed to create a manageable opening, but he underestimated how quickly the entities would exploit any weakness in the barrier system. Sarah pointed to something that made June's blood run cold. "Look at his team. They're not trying to shut down the breach anymore." June could see that Sarah was right. Thorn's associates had abandoned their equipment and were backing away from the expanding supernatural corruption with expressions of terror. Whatever they'd been promised in exchange for helping with this operation, they clearly hadn't been prepared for the reality of encountering otherworld entities. Only Thorn himself remained near the breach, and June could see that he was no longer in control of the situation. The entities that had emerged were surrounding him, not attacking but communicating in ways that suggested negotiation rather than conquest. The realization hit her with sickening clarity. Thorn hadn't been trying to release the entities for his own benefit. He'd been working for them, helping them engineer a crisis that would force the Guardian network to reveal its weaknesses. "It's been a trap from the beginning," she whispered. "Not just for me, but for the entire system." Elizabeth nodded grimly. "The entities have been using humans with supernatural sensitivity as unwitting agents for decades, feeding them just enough knowledge to be dangerous but not enough to understand the consequences of their actions. Thorn believes he's going to gain power and knowledge from this exchange, but he's actually just another tool being used to destabilize the barriers." June watched as more entities emerged from the breach, each one taking a form that seemed designed to exploit human psychological weaknesses. Some appeared as beautiful ethereal beings that radiated peace and wisdom. Others took shapes that triggered deep-seated fears and desires. All of them moved with purpose and intelligence that made it clear they'd been planning this moment for far longer than any human could comprehend. The original Guardians designed the barrier system to contain entities that operated as individuals, Tommy explained. But these things have learned to function as a collective intelligence. When one site is breached, they all benefit from the knowledge gained. Sarah's grandfather's journal contained diagrams that illustrated the true scope of the threat. According to this, there are over 200 barrier sites across the Appalachian mountain range, each one containing between dozens and hundreds of individual entities. If they all work together to destabilize the network simultaneously, June didn't need her to finish the thought. The math was simple and terrifying. Thousands of otherworld entities, each one capable of reshaping reality according to alien principles, all coordinating their efforts to break free into a world that had no defenses against that kind of threat. "The transformation Elizabeth is offering," June said slowly. "Would it give me the power to face all of them?" "Not alone," Elizabeth replied. "But it would make you capable of establishing a new kind of guardian network, one that involves willing participants rather than inherited burdens, one that can adapt and evolve as the threats change." June felt the vial of concentrated essence grow warm in her hand, responding to her proximity to a decision. The liquid inside seemed to glow with its own light, and she could sense the tremendous power it contained, power that would either transform her into something beyond human limitations or burn through her mortal form in the process of stabilizing the collapsing network. "If I choose the transformation, what happens to the current barrier system?" "It evolves," Elizabeth said. "Instead of containing the entities in static prisons, the new network would create dynamic boundaries, zones where human and otherworld reality can coexist safely, monitored and maintained by guardians who understand both realms." Tommy frowned at this explanation. "That sounds like it would require a fundamental change in how humans understand reality itself." "The world is changing, whether we guide it or not," Elizabeth replied. "The entities have been influencing human development for generations, introducing ideas and technologies that prepare our species for eventual contact. The question is whether that contact happens on human terms or theirs." Below them, Thorne's situation had deteriorated further. The entities surrounding him were no longer bothering with the pretense of negotiation. They were beginning to merge with his physical form, using his body as an anchor point in human reality. His screams carried clearly through the night air, a sound that spoke of transformation rather than death, of being reshaped according to alien principles that cared nothing for human limitations or desires. "We're out of time," Sarah said urgently. "Look at the forest around us." June turned and saw that the supernatural corruption was spreading beyond the immediate area of the breach. Trees throughout the surrounding forest were beginning to show signs of otherworld influence, bark that flowed like liquid, leaves that sang in harmonies that made her ears ring, branches that reached toward the sky with movements that suggested awareness and intent. "The entities are using the breach as a beachhead," Tommy realized. "They're not trying to escape the barrier system. They're trying to transform our entire reality into something that can sustain them." June felt the master key burn against her chest as it responded to the escalating crisis. The pendant was designed to maintain the stability of the barrier network, but that network was failing faster than any single guardian could reinforce it. The traditional tools and rituals weren't adequate for a threat of this magnitude. "I need to know exactly what the transformation involves," she said to Elizabeth. "What will I become and what will I lose?" Elizabeth's form grew more solid as she focused her energy on providing a clear answer. "You'll retain your human consciousness and memories, but you'll gain the ability to perceive and manipulate supernatural forces directly. You'll be able to travel between realms, to communicate with entities on their own level, and to establish new kinds of boundaries that protect human reality without imprisoning the otherworld forces. And the cost? You'll never again be able to live a purely human existence. You'll be connected to every supernatural site across the mountain range, aware of every threat and responsible for maintaining the balance. You'll age differently, think differently, and relate to the world in ways that will make it difficult to maintain normal human relationships." June looked at Sarah, seeing in the younger woman's face the future that she herself would be giving up, a life of human connections, of simple pleasures and ordinary concerns, of the possibility of love and family and the comfortable illusion that the world was a safe and predictable place. "But you'd be saving all of that for everyone else," Sarah said quietly. Understanding the magnitude of what June was considering, the choice crystallized in June's mind with sudden clarity. For 20 years, she'd lived in isolation, building a life based on self-reliance and independence. She'd already sacrificed the possibility of normal human existence when she'd fled to the mountains after her personal and professional betrayals. The transformation Elizabeth offered wouldn't take away a life she'd already chosen to abandon. It would give new meaning and purpose to the solitude she'd already accepted. How do I begin the transformation? Elizabeth smiled with an expression that combined relief and sorrow. Drink the essence Tommy prepared. Use the master key to establish a connection with every barrier site simultaneously and accept the power that flows through the network. But June, once you begin, there's no way back. June uncorked the vial and held it up to catch the strange light that was beginning to emanate from the expanding supernatural activity below. The liquid inside swirled with colors that shouldn't exist, each one representing a different aspect of otherworld reality that she would soon need to understand and master. "Before I do this," she said, looking at Tommy and Sarah, "I need you both to promise me something." "Anything," Sarah replied immediately. "Help me build the new network. Find others with supernatural sensitivity, people who can be trained as guardians without being burdened with inherited curses. Make sure that what I'm about to become serves humanity rather than replacing it." Tommy nodded gravely. "My family has been preparing for this possibility for generations. We know how to identify potential guardians, how to train them, and how to maintain the knowledge that keeps the supernatural world and human world in balance. And I'll document everything," Sarah added. "My grandfather's work will become the foundation for understanding how the new network operates." June took one last look at her hands that had built a cabin, carved a walking stick, learned to survive in the wilderness through trial and error and stubborn determination. In a few moments, those hands would be capable of reshaping reality itself. But they would never again know the simple satisfaction of purely human accomplishment. She raised the vial to her lips, feeling the concentrated essence radiate power that made her entire body vibrate with anticipation. Around her neck, the master key began to glow with increasing intensity, responding to the proximity of the catalyst that would unlock its ultimate potential. "For everyone who doesn't have the choice I'm about to make," she said, and drank the liquid starlight that would transform her from a woman hiding from the world into a guardian, standing between worlds. The essence hit June's system like liquid lightning, flooding her consciousness with awareness that expanded beyond anything she'd imagined possible. Her vision exploded into spectrums of light that had no names, showing her the true structure of reality, layers upon layers of existence that intersected and influenced each other in patterns of incredible complexity. She could see the barrier network as it actually was, a web of supernatural energy that connected every marked site across the mountains, pulsing with power that had been slowly failing for decades. But more importantly, she could see the entities themselves, not as the terrifying alien forms they projected to human perception, but as beings of pure consciousness that existed in realms where thought and reality were indistinguishable. They weren't evil in any human sense. They were simply so fundamentally different from earthly life that their presence in human reality would reshape it according to principles that no terrestrial organism could survive. The walking stick in her hand began to glow with the same otherworldly light that now coursed through her veins. But its transformation was more dramatic than she'd expected. The simple oak wood she'd carved 20 years ago revealed its true nature. It had always been more than just a tool, growing from a tree that had absorbed supernatural energy from the barrier sites for generations. As her enhanced awareness touched it, the stick elongated and strengthened, becoming a staff that could channel forces capable of reshaping the fundamental laws of physics. The chains across her shoulder underwent a similar transformation, their iron links becoming something that existed partially in human reality and partially in the otherworld realm. She could feel their weight change as they adapted to her new nature, becoming restraints that could bind beings of pure consciousness as easily as they could contain physical threats. Most dramatically, the master key around her neck began to pulse with power that threatened to burn through her shirt. When she lifted it to examine the change, June saw that the locket had opened to reveal not just Elizabeth's miniature painting, but a three-dimensional map of the entire barrier network. Every site was represented by a glowing point of light, and she could see instantly which barriers were strong, which were failing, and which had already been compromised. "The transformation is working," Elizabeth's voice said, though June realized she was no longer hearing it with her ears. Elizabeth's presence had become part of her enhanced consciousness, a guide and ally existing within the expanded awareness that now defined her being. "You can feel the network as I do now, as a living system that responds to will and intention rather than just ritual and tradition." June stood, marveling at how different her body felt. She was still recognizably herself, but every movement carried power that seemed to bend space around her. The forest that had been her home for 20 years now revealed hidden depths, streams of supernatural energy flowing between the trees, points where otherworld reality pressed close against the human realm, and most clearly of all, the expanding corruption that radiated from Thorn's breach like an infection spreading through healthy tissue. "I can see what they're trying to do," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that hadn't been there before. "They're not just trying to escape, they're trying to create a permanent bridge between realms." Tommy and Sarah were staring at her with expressions of awe and concern. To their human perception, June was surrounded by an aura of light that made it difficult to look at her directly, and her movements seemed to leave traces in the air itself. "Can you stop them?" Sarah asked. June focused her enhanced awareness on the breach below, seeing it with clarity that revealed both the immediate danger and the long-term solution. "Not the way the old guardians would have. But I can do something better. I can give them what they actually want while protecting what humanity needs." She began to descend toward the breach, her movements carrying her through the forest faster than should have been physically possible. The supernatural staff in her hand cut through the otherworld corruption like a blade through shadow, creating paths of clean space where Tommy and Sarah could follow safely. As they approached the edge of the stone circle, June could see Thorn's fate more clearly. The entities hadn't killed him. They'd transformed him into something that served as a living gateway between realms. His body had become a focal point for otherworld energy, but he was conscious and aware of what was happening to him. His screams had stopped, not because his suffering had ended, but because he'd been changed in ways that made human expressions of pain irrelevant. "Dr. Thorn," June called, her voice carrying power that cut through the supernatural chaos surrounding the breach. "I know you can hear me." The entities that had been using Thorn's form as an anchor point turned their attention to her, and June felt their alien consciousness pressing against her transformed awareness. But instead of the overwhelming terror she'd expected, she found she could understand them. Their thoughts were vast and strange, but they followed patterns that her enhanced mind could decode. They were not malevolent. They were desperate. They had been imprisoned for over a century in realms that were slowly dying, cut off from the energy sources they needed to maintain their existence. The barrier system that human guardians had maintained so carefully wasn't just containing them, it was slowly strangling them. "You've been dying in your prisons," June said, "not just to the entities around Thorn, but to all of them across the network." Her transformed voice carried to every barrier site simultaneously, reaching entities that had been isolated for generations. "And we've been dying trying to maintain barriers that were never meant to be permanent." The entity's response came as a wave of communication that would have destroyed an unprotected human mind. But June's enhanced consciousness could process their complex message. They confirmed what she'd intuited. The original barrier system had been designed as a temporary measure, a way to contain dangerous forces until a better solution could be found. But the knowledge of how to establish that better solution had been lost, leaving both sides trapped in a cycle that benefited no one. "I can offer you something different," June continued. raising the Guardian's staff and feeling power flow through it that connected her to every supernatural site across the mountains. Not escape into human reality, but access to a realm where you can exist without destroying what we need to survive. She used the Master Key to establish connections not just to the barrier sites, but to the spaces between realms, areas of existence that were neither fully human nor fully otherworldly. These transitional zones had always existed, but previous Guardians had lacked the ability to perceive them, much less make use of them. With her enhanced awareness, June could see how to reshape the failing barrier system into something more sophisticated, a network of managed boundaries that would allow controlled interaction between realms while protecting the fundamental integrity of each reality. It would require constant maintenance and monitoring, but it would end the slow strangulation that was killing both the imprisoned entities and the human Guardians charged with containing them. The transformation she was proposing would fundamentally change how supernatural forces operated in the human world. But it would also ensure that both realms could continue to exist and evolve without mutual destruction. This is what Elizabeth meant about establishing a new kind of network, Sarah said, watching June work with power that reshaped reality around her, not just containing threats, but creating sustainable coexistence. June felt the entities considering her proposal, their vast intelligences evaluating possibilities that stretched across geological time scales. The communication process was complex beyond human comprehension, but her transformed consciousness could follow the general patterns of their debate. Some entities were interested in her offer of transitional realms where they could exist without corrupting human reality. Others had been imprisoned so long that they wanted nothing except escape, regardless of the consequences. A few had become so twisted by their confinement that they genuinely sought to destroy the reality that had caged them. The resolution of their internal conflict would determine whether June's transformation had been sufficient to save both worlds, or whether she would need to use her new powers in ways that would make her as alien to humanity as the entities she was trying to negotiate with. The entities' debate reached a crescendo that manifested as reality storms around the breach site, sections of forest where the laws of physics became suggestions rather than rules. Trees aged centuries and seconds before reversing to saplings. Rocks flowed like water before crystallizing into impossible geometric forms. And the air itself took on properties that made breathing an act of conscious will rather than automatic reflex. June stood at the center of the chaos, her transformed consciousness serving as a stable anchor point in the swirling madness. She could feel the weight of decision pressing down on the entity collective. Some were ready to accept her proposal for transitional realms, but others saw her offer as just another form of imprisonment, more sophisticated but no less restricting than the barriers that had contained them for over a century. The Master Key against her chest grew so hot it was like holding molten metal. But June realized the heat wasn't harmful. It was the pendant responding to its true purpose, preparing to unlock not just the prison sites, but the spaces between worlds where new kinds of existence could flourish. The key had always been designed for this moment, this choice between destruction and transformation. "I can feel their conflict," June said to Elizabeth's presence within her consciousness. "They're afraid that accepting the transitional realms means giving up their chance for true freedom." "Show them what true freedom would actually cost," Elizabeth replied. "Let them see what happens if they force their way into human reality without adaptation." June raised the Guardian's staff and channeled her enhanced awareness through the network, creating a vision that reached every entity across the mountain range. She showed them human civilization as it actually was, billions of interconnected lives creating a reality based on physical laws, biological needs and psychological structures that had evolved specifically to support terrestrial existence. But more importantly, she showed them what would happen if otherworld consciousness tried to exist within that framework, without modification. The entity's natural abilities to reshape reality through thought and desire would create cascading changes that would make human life impossible, not through malice, but through fundamental incompatibility. Their very presence would transform the physical universe into something that could sustain beings of pure consciousness, but would be instantly lethal to any life form that required stable matter and predictable physics. The vision hit the entity collective like a revelation. Many of them had never truly understood why their imprisonment was necessary, assuming it was based on fear or prejudice rather than practical incompatibility. For the first time, they could see that human guardians hadn't been acting as jailers, but as protectors of a reality that both species needed to preserve. "The transitional realms I'm offering," June continued, her voice carrying across the supernatural network with crystalline clarity, "would give you spaces where you can exist according to your own nature, while still having access to the energy flows and dimensional structures you need to survive. You wouldn't be prisoners, you'd be neighbors." The response came as a shifting in the fabric of reality itself. The entities most committed to escape began to withdraw their influence from the breach, recognizing that June's proposal offered genuine benefits rather than just a more comfortable cage. But the ones who had been most damaged by their imprisonment pressed forward with increasing desperation, determined to break free regardless of the consequences. Some of them are too far gone, June realized, feeling the approaching presence of entities whose consciousness had been twisted by over a century of isolation and rage. They can't accept any solution that doesn't involve destroying the barriers entirely. The corrupted entities burst through the breach with force that sent shockwaves across multiple realities, their forms shifting and changing as they tried to impose their chaotic nature on the ordered structure of human existence. Where they touched the ground, the earth began to scream, not metaphorically, but with actual sounds of pain as matter itself was forced to behave according to principles that violated its fundamental nature. June stepped forward to meet them, the binding chains flowing from her shoulder into her hands like liquid metal that solidified into restraints capable of holding beings of pure thought. The confrontation that followed wasn't physical combat in any conventional sense. It was a battle of wills fought across multiple dimensions simultaneously. With the future of both realms hanging in the balance, the corrupted entities struck at her with weapons made from crystallized madness and arrows of pure entropy, attacks that could have unraveled the quantum foundations of reality itself. But June's transformation had prepared her for exactly this kind of conflict. She countered with barriers woven from the binding chains, creating shields that existed in both human and other-world space simultaneously. "You offer us cages with prettier bars," one of the corrupted entities communicated, its thoughts carrying the weight of accumulated rage and despair. "We want freedom, not management." "What you want would destroy both of us," June replied, using the Guardian's staff to channel power that stabilized the reality distortions around them. "True freedom means choosing solutions that allow everyone to survive and thrive." The battle intensified as more corrupted entities joined the assault. But June began to notice something that gave her hope. The entities who had accepted her proposal weren't just standing aside. They were actively working to contain their corrupted kindred, recognizing that the actions of the few threatened the salvation of the many. With their help, June was able to use the binding chains not just as restraints, but as conduits for transformative energy. Instead of simply containing the corrupted entities, she began the delicate process of healing the damage that imprisonment had done to their consciousness. It was dangerous work, touching minds that had been twisted by despair and isolation risked contaminating her own transformed awareness with their madness. But Elizabeth's presence within her consciousness provided guidance and stability. showing June how to maintain her sense of self while still offering empathy and healing to beings whose suffering had driven them beyond reason. Slowly, carefully, she began to undo the psychological damage that had made the corrupted entities unable to accept anything except destruction. The healing process created its own reality storms. As the entity's consciousness shifted from patterns of rage and despair to something approaching hope and reason. But these storms were creative rather than destructive, reshaping the area around the breach into something that was neither fully human nor fully otherworldly, a demonstration of what the transitional realms would look like once properly established. Tommy and Sarah watched from a safe distance as June worked, documenting the process and maintaining the human perspective that would be crucial for explaining the new system to people who lacked supernatural sensitivity. They could see that June was still recognizably herself, but she was also becoming something unprecedented, a being who could exist comfortably in multiple realities while remaining committed to protecting all of them. The network is stabilizing, Sarah observed, consulting her grandfather's modified instruments. The reality distortions are organizing themselves into coherent patterns instead of chaotic interference. Tommy nodded, his weathered face showing satisfaction at seeing generations of preparation finally bearing fruit. She's not just stopping the crisis, she's solving the underlying problem that created it. The final breakthrough came when the last of the corrupted entities accepted June's healing touch and joined the collective effort to establish the new boundary system. With all the supernatural forces working together, the transformation of the barrier network accelerated beyond what June had thought possible. The transitional realms began to manifest as stable zones where the laws of physics became more flexible without becoming completely chaotic. These spaces would allow entities to exist according to their own nature while providing humans with access to supernatural knowledge and abilities that had been locked away for over a century. But the most important change was in June herself. The transformation had stabilized into something that preserved her humanity while granting her the power to maintain the new system indefinitely. She would serve as the primary guardian of the transitional realms. But she wouldn't be alone. Others with supernatural sensitivity could be trained to share the responsibility, creating a network of willing protectors rather than isolated inheritors of an inherited curse. As the crisis resolved and the new system took hold, June felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond personal accomplishment. She had found a way to honor her family's legacy while breaking the cycle of sacrifice and isolation that had claimed so many generations before her. The mountains that had been her refuge for 20 years would now become the foundation for a new kind of coexistence between worlds. 3 months after the transformation of the barrier network, June stood on the porch of her rebuilt cabin, watching the sunrise paint the Blue Ridge peaks in colors that now held deeper meaning for her enhanced perception. The mountains still looked like the same refuge that had sheltered her for 20 years, but she could see the layers of reality that most humans missed, the flowing streams of supernatural energy that connected every living thing, the gentle boundaries that kept different realms in healthy separation, and the new growth that was beginning to flourish in the transitional zones. Her cabin had been rebuilt not because it was destroyed in the supernatural crisis, but because her transformed nature required spaces that could exist comfortably in multiple realities simultaneously. The new structure looked similar to the original from the outside, but the interior contained rooms that were larger than their external dimensions suggested, and windows that looked out onto landscapes that existed in the transitional realms as well as human reality. The walking stick she'd carved 20 years ago had evolved into something magnificent, a staff that could channel power between worlds while still serving as a simple tool for navigating mountain trails. She kept it close not because she needed it for mobility, but because it remained a connection to the woman she'd been before her transformation. a reminder that power should serve practical purposes rather than existing for its own sake. Tommy had become her primary liaison with the human world, helping to identify and train others with supernatural sensitivity who could serve as guardians for the new network. Unlike the old system, where each guardian worked in isolation until the calling claimed her life, the transitional realm network required teams of people who could share the responsibility and support each other through the challenges of maintaining boundaries between worlds. Sarah had documented everything, creating guides and protocols that would allow future generations to understand and maintain the system without having to rediscover the knowledge through trial and error. Her grandfather's research had provided the foundation, but Sarah's work was building a comprehensive understanding of how human and otherworld consciousness could coexist without mutual destruction. Dr. Marcus Thorne had survived his ordeal, though he remained permanently changed by his experience as a bridge between realms. The entities had released him once the new system was established, but his consciousness retained connections to otherworld reality that made him valuable as a translator and negotiator. Under careful supervision, he was helping to establish communication protocols that would prevent future misunderstandings. Between human and entity perspectives, the transitional zones themselves had become places of wonder that attracted researchers, artists, and philosophers from around the world. The flexible physics of these areas allowed for experiments and discoveries that were impossible in purely human reality, while the presence of entity consciousness provided insights into forms of existence that expanded human understanding of what life could become. June received regular visitors now, people who came seeking guidance about supernatural experiences, researchers who wanted to understand the new boundary system, and occasionally individuals who showed signs of inheriting guardian abilities themselves. Her isolation had ended not through a return to conventional human society, but through the creation of a new kind of community that bridged multiple realms of existence. The entities had proven to be remarkable neighbors once the barriers to communication were removed. Their consciousness operated on timescales that made them patient teachers and advisors, while their ability to perceive reality from non-human perspectives provided solutions to problems that had seemed intractable from purely terrestrial viewpoints. They were particularly helpful with environmental restoration, using their reality-shaping abilities to accelerate healing in damaged ecosystems. June often spent her evenings writing in a new journal, documenting the ongoing evolution of the transitional realm network and recording observations that would guide future guardians. The work was challenging but fulfilling in ways that her previous career had never been. Every day brought new discoveries and opportunities to help both human and entity communities thrive. The supernatural seeds that had appeared around the sealed barrier sites had grown into gardens of unprecedented beauty, producing plants that existed simultaneously in multiple realities and created food that could nourish both physical and spiritual needs. June tended these gardens as part of her guardian duties, but also because she enjoyed the connection to the earth that had always been central to her mountain existence. She had occasional contact with the outside world through satellite communications that now worked perfectly, but she found herself less interested in human politics and social media than she'd expected. The perspective that came with her transformation made many human concerns seem temporary and ultimately unimportant, while the work of maintaining boundaries between worlds felt increasingly urgent and meaningful. Elizabeth's presence remained part of her consciousness, but it had evolved from guidance to companionship. The ancestor who had pioneered many of the techniques June now used had become a permanent partner in the work of maintaining the new system. Her accumulated experience balanced by June's fresh perspectives and modern understanding. On quiet mornings like this one, June reflected on the path that had brought her from a broken corporate executive to a guardian of multiple realities. The pain and betrayal that had driven her to the mountains seemed like necessary preparation for the challenges she now faced, teaching her the self-reliance and independence that made her transformation possible. She no longer missed her previous life or wondered what might have been if she'd made different choices. The woman who had fled to the mountains seeking escape had found instead a purpose that used every skill she'd ever developed. The strategic thinking from her business career, the survival skills from her mountain years, and the emotional resilience that had carried her through every major transition. The master key around her neck had settled into a comfortable warmth that pulsed gently with the rhythms of the transitional realm network. It no longer burned with urgent crisis energy, but glowed with the steady light of systems functioning as they were designed to. When she held it up to catch the morning sun, the pendant showed her a map of supernatural activity across the entire mountain range, dozens of transitional zones where human and entity communities were learning to work together, all connected by flows of energy that strengthened both realms. As the sun climbed higher and began to burn off the morning mist, June made her daily inspection of the garden that surrounded her cabin. The supernatural plants grew in patterns that spelled out messages from entity friends, while the more conventional vegetables provided food for the increasing number of human visitors who came to learn about the new boundary system. Today would bring new challenges and opportunities, as every day did in her transformed existence. There would be consultations with guardian trainees, negotiations with newly contacted entity groups, and the constant work of maintaining the delicate balance that allowed multiple realities to coexist peacefully. But first, there was coffee. Real coffee, still her one luxury, still served in the same chipped ceramic mug she'd used for 20 years. Some things, June had learned, were worth preserving exactly as they were, even when everything else about existence was transformed beyond recognition. She settled into the chair on her porch, watching the transitional zones shimmer with morning light and feeling the deep satisfaction that came from work that served purposes larger than herself. The mountains had given her refuge when she needed it most. And now she was giving back by ensuring they would remain a place where different forms of life could flourish and grow. The woman who had once run from the world to find peace in isolation had become the bridge between worlds, proof that even the most difficult transformations could lead to purposes worth embracing. In the distance, she could hear the sounds of a new day beginning, both the familiar calls of mountain wildlife and the stranger music of entity consciousness learning to sing in harmony with terrestrial existence. June Whitmore, guardian of the transitional realms, keeper of boundaries between worlds, smiled as she lifted her coffee mug to toast another sunrise over the mountains that had become her true home.